Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. Today, we are diving into the second installment of our exploration of the unbelievably great, legendary Alice Munro. So today we are taking a look at lives of girls and women in order to explore some of the larger pieces, larger messages, larger themes, larger explorations in her prose in general, but certainly in lives of girls and women. So the first installment was mostly looking at the prose, looking very carefully at the language to see how she pulls off this incredible feat of literary mastery. And now today we're going to be looking at things a little bit more broadly, a little bit more widely. In the third installment, we're going to look very closely at one short story called Silence. And in that, we will be talking somewhat about the structure of the short story and what a master she is of the form, and also just about the prose and about that story in general. As always, we're going to kick off with this question of why read Alice Munro? Partially, we are reading her now because she recently died at the ripe age of 92. And I mentioned this in the first one. I'm very happy that she received all of the accolades that she did. She won a Man Booker International Prize for her lifetime of work. And more importantly, she also won a whole bunch of other prizes, but she also won the Nobel-Prize for Literature. And I think it was incredibly well-deserved because in many ways, her prose and her handling of the short story is unique and just really, trailblazing in lots of ways. Even just for the form, for the short story form, she just did, amazing, amazing things. So that is why we are reading her, because she is great, and also because she died recently, which is sad. Okay, for those of you who want an agenda, today we are going to dive in with a very brief bio. I had a slightly more robust biography of her in session one, but we're just going to touch on some of the important points today. Then we're going to dive in to this volume, Lives of Girls and Women. We'll talk about the title, the table of contents, and the opening of the novel. Then we're going to talk about the structure of this novel. We will then be talking about some of these moments of honesty. So there are these moments throughout Alice Munro, not just in this collection, but in all of her work. There are these moments where she distills things in a way that I think is unbelievably smart and just like really demonstrates an ability to shape the English language into just absolutely startling ways. So we're going to take a look at some of those moments. They're moments of kind of revelation or of articulation. We're going to talk about religion throughout the book, shame throughout the book, which is fairly interconnected in some ways with religion. We're going to talk about sex, which is also bound up in religion and shame. And then we are going to talk about the use of humor and then look at the close of the novel. So as we are looking at all of these things, of course, we will also be parsing why, in fact, the prose is unique and just so effective at what she is trying to do. So I just literally forgot her name, Alice Munro. Alice Munro was born in 1931 in southwestern Ontario in a little tiny town called Wingham. And actually at the end of Lives and Girls and Women, we're going to talk about how when she was growing up there, she wasn't totally clear on how incredibly impactful the town would be. But even by the end of Lives and Girls and Women, which it was published in 1971, so she was 40 years old when she wrote it. And it was a time of really looking back and really appreciating all of the details that are used so effectively in her writing to, really speak about some big truths, not just about childhood, but really about young adulthood and even some adulthood questions. She married twice. She married once and then divorced that man. She had 3 daughters with him, one of whom died in infancy. She and Mr. Munro opened a bookstore in Victoria, which is in fact still in business. In 1972, actually right after Lives of Girls and Women came out, she divorced her husband then, Mr. Munro, went to teach at the University of Ontario, met and married a man there, and was married to him until he died at age 88 in 2013. I have that in my notes here. And then she herself died on May 13th of 2024. So there's our very brief biography. Importantly, she's Canadian. She is known as kind of, I would argue that she is in fact the finest of all of the Canadian prose writers. Margaret Atwood is amazing. I actually really, really love Mavis Gallant, who is another short story writer. You know, there are a handful of really, really excellent Canadian writers, but I think Alice Munro is so legendary and is just so adept at not only the use of language, but at structuring things and at finding resonance that I'm not sure she has like a lot of competition. I think Mavis Gallant actually really deserves a lot more attention than she gets. But I'm very happy that Alice Munro is very much in the spotlight in lots of different ways. She mostly wrote short stories, which is kind of important here because Lives of Girls and Women is sold as a novel. And it was, again, published in 1971. I actually don't know how many collections she had put together by then. So she would write these longish short stories and would publish them in different publications and then would collect them. So I think she has maybe 10 collections, each about 9 or 10 stories. So you're looking at 100 stories over the course of her lifetime. I don't know if that includes Lives and Girls of Girls and Women, but I'm giving you kind of round numbers here. Lives of Girls and Women, she spoke about in an interview that it feels, it feels like it has some cohesion, and we're going to actually look at that. But it feels somewhat like a novel in that we have this one character, Del Jordan, who is, sort of her life is what is kind of on display here, and it's nicely chronological. But it is very clear in many ways, which we are also going to look at, that these can stand alone as short stories. And the fact that they do stand alone so well as discrete short stories is really telling in lots of ways. She herself said she wanted to be, an author of novels, and just wasn't. It just wasn't what, it wasn't how her writing sort of evolved, and it wasn't the way that she thought. So the way that she wrote Lives of Girls and Women was essentially by kind of chunking it into these discrete parts. Okay, we are now going to dive into the text. So here is my copy. I think this is, if you're on YouTube, if you're on YouTube, you can see that I am wearing a sweater that is very eggplant in color. Before, in section 1, I was wearing a green sweater that was in fact Nile green, which has everything to do with the American Nile, is her name, who was in that comes up in Lives of Girls and Women. And now I am wearing eggplant because, in fact, at one point, Del has a dress on that Jerry, I always call him Larry, that Jerry calls eggplant. So I'm getting, although I really, I like this sweater. She was not that happy with her dress, and it became kind of a joke. But I am, oh my gosh, I'm also enjoying the way that the V-neck of my sweater is really accenting the relatively kind of aubergine, V-neck of whatever this is that Alice Munro is wearing on the cover of this volume, this novel. So I am holding up the Lives of Girls and Women. That is a paperback edition. It has a very nice gold seal on there that is advertising the fact that Alice has a Nobel Prize. It also has Alice Munro right in the center in big type. I actually really enjoy that color and the font too. Really, Alice Munro, the sort of title of whatever the collection is secondary, absolutely, with respect to her name, because her name, it's really Alice Munro who is selling these volumes more than any title is going to be catchy. Lives of Girls and Women, which is very much like in her other collected volumes of short fiction, it is the name of one of the stories that we will come across, and that tends to be how she is naming these different collected story volumes. But again, in this case, this purports to be a novel. So it says Lives of Girls and Women, a novel. I'm interested in the fact that there is no definite article. It is not the Lives of Girls and Women, it's Lives of Girls and Women. And the definite article, it makes it sort of more specific and more definite. When you leave that out, there is a kind of a generalizing that happens that I really like very much. So this is speaking about lives of many girls and women, not the lives. It just gets slightly more specific when we have the definite article. I also love the fact that many of the short stories here, when she's taking the title, she has pulled the title from the short story text. So I am really bad at coming up with titles. And back when I was writing, it was really a handy trick, which is simply to read through your story and pull out a phrase. And it should be one that has broad connotations and that is going to point your reader in the right direction. But certainly in short fiction, it can be very resonant and very powerful to pull out a small snippet. In this case, she is quoting her mother. Well, our narrator, Dell, is quoting her mother, who is talking about changes in the lives of girls and women. So it's very, once you have read it and once you remember that, there is this real resonance here about change. And it's important to remember, again, this is published in 1971. I haven't read actually the giganto biography that I ordered of Alice Munro, but she, I believe, moved to teach at the University of Ontario in 1972. So you can imagine that this was perhaps the end of her marriage to Mr. Munro, and that maybe there were a lot of changes in her own life that would have bolstered the idea of changes in lives of girls and women in general, not to mention the 60s was happening and the 70s. I also have to assume that this is a photograph of Alice Munro. I'm not totally sure, and I did a lot of looking around in the frontis matter and in the back and on the cover to try to make sure that that is the case. But I'm fairly certain that is in fact her. Nowhere is it actually like attributed exactly. There are two different people who get photograph author photo credit here, but it's not totally clear to me. I'm fairly certain though that is Alice on the front. Usually when we are looking at a book, we don't spend much time looking at the frontis matter, but in this case, I want to just take a quick look at some of this boilerplate stuff in the front, partially because we have this little note here from A.M., Alice Munro herself. So she says the following: "This novel is autobiographical in form, but not in fact. My family, neighbors, and friends did not serve as models." A.M. So this is very interesting to me because the idea of form but not fact is interesting. When she's talking about form here, I don't believe she's talking about short fiction versus novel. What she's talking about here is, fiction versus nonfiction. So the idea of it being autobiographical in form, I mean, I think she means that this is happening in a small town in Ontario and that there is a certain chronology and there's certain adventures that are happening and it's a certain coming of age of this young girl, which in many ways I think can be read. She's inviting us in some ways, even with this protestation here, by saying it's not actually, she does say it's autobiographical in form. So we are invited to a certain extent to, to imagine that this is in fact, fairly autobiographical. At the very end, she talks about the beginning of writing her first novel and how she really is writing it about one of the families in town. So you definitely get the sense that this is lots of fodder. Wingham is providing lots of fodder, a lot of grist for her mill. We also, I liked this here, in terms of the Library of Congress, the cataloging and publication and whatnot. Down here, it says, number 1, Young Women - Fiction, Canada - Fiction, which I just think is so funny. The idea of just, fiction in Canada, this is really an important book in terms of the canon of Canadian fiction. Okay, it's for Jim. Here, I believe James Munro is her husband's name. In fact, I would imagine that she is dedicating it to her husband. I am not certain, but again, given the timing of when this is published, you would imagine, in fact, that at a minimum, there is, there's some disagreement or some sort of discord in their marriage that is heading toward her departure from Victoria. Okay. We are then going to move on to the table of contents. And I want to briefly talk about this. I love a good table of contents. So in this case, it's actually extra important because this kind of bolsters my argument that this is in fact a collection of stories more than it is, the usual shape of a fictional novel. That's redundant. All novels are fictional. So we have these titles, and each of them is the title of essentially of a short story. They also aren't, sometimes when you have a list of chapters, there's a similarity among all the chapters, but these really, to me, feel like they are very discrete, very different short stories. So we have The Flats Road, Errors of the Living Body, Princess Ida, Age of Faith, Changes in Ceremonies, Lives of Girls and Women, Baptizing, and Epilogue, The Photographer. So what we're going to do is take a quick look at where these phrases pop up in the stories. The first one comes up on page 31. It is important to note, too, that Alice tends to write very long, short stories. And in fact, there are many people say that essentially she has, more than what you would find in a normal novel in the universe of each one of her short stories. And I absolutely agree with that. I think sometimes she can condense an entire novel into a paragraph or even a sentence. Even a minor character really, it feels incredibly well explored. So on 31, we have this. This is in the very first story called The Flats Road. My mother sat in a canvas chair and my father in a wooden one. They did not look at each other, but they were connected. And this connection was plain as a fence. It was between us and Uncle Benny, us and the Flats Road. It would stay between us and anything. So we have this right from the beginning. Again, this is early in the book, and this is when Dell is a young girl. In fact, we haven't heard her name yet. And this first story, The Flats Road, is very concerned with the differences between her mother and her father. And in fact, throughout the novel, the father stays out on the Flats Road and the mother spends the weeks in town with the children so that they can go to school more easily. So you have this idea of the Flats Road, this geography as being incredibly important. And here she's taking that one step further to draw even more stark distinctions between her father and her mother. Even the chairs that they're sitting in, this canvas chair, I'm imagining like a director chair that the mother is sitting in. And in fact, at one point, this is kind of likened to kind of a modern chair. And then her father on kind of like a more straightforward wooden, more old-fashioned chair. There are lots of ways in which these things are symbolic. I mean, we could mine this one tiny sentence here for hours and hours, which we will not do. Okay, so, and then I want to go back to the table of contents and look at our next snippet. Heirs of the Living Body is a little phrase that it's the title of the second chapter / story. It is also a phrase that appears on page 55. We're going to take a look at that. Interestingly, a lot of these titles of the stories are taken from a quotation of the mother. So this is a lot of the mother's words that end up as the titles. So this is the mother talking about death after Dell's Uncle Craig has died. On page 55 down at the bottom here. She's talking about transplantation. The mother's a big reader. She reads very, very widely and is very curious intellectually. Also, she is atheistic or at least agnostic, depending on who you're asking in the story, whether it's Dell or her best friend Naomi. But it's a very big deal to not be a person of faith in a small town in Canada where everyone belongs to a church. We're going to get to religion. But so this is a very large statement that we are hearing, and in fact, it becomes the title of Heirs of the Living Body. Even brains. I wonder, could they transplant brains? So all these parts won't die at all. They'll go on living as part of someone else, part of another combination. Then you won't be able properly to speak of death at all. Heirs of the Living Body. That's what the article was called. We would all be heirs of one another's bodies. We would all be donors, too. Death as we know it now would be done away with. We're not going to parse this too carefully, but it's interesting that the mother is talking about transplantation as the way that we would go on living in other people's bodies, when in fact you could argue that, having a child who has been made of your flesh and blood is another way that you in fact go on living and that you sort of defy death. There's a lot of preoccupation with sex and death throughout this entire book, more death and faith at the beginning and more sex and shame, in the sort of last 2/3. But we have this idea right from the beginning. It's a scientific, article that she is reading, Heirs of the Living Body. But there's also this very important thing about this title, both of the article and of the story / chapter, as being quoted by the mother. Okay, we're going to look at one last example of when the title of a short story is seen in the text of the story itself. On page 193, this is the title story. This is the Lives of Girls and Women, and we're going to see where that pops up in the text. Again, this comes from the mother, which, I think it's extremely important that so many of these titles are, in fact, words that are spoken by the mother. My mother spoke to me in her grave, hopeful, lecturing voice. There is a change coming, I think, in the lives of girls and women. Yes, but it is up to us to make it come. All women have had, up till now, has been their connection with men. All we have had. No more lives of our own, really, than domestic animals. You will want to have children, though. That was how much she knew me. But I hope you will. Use your brains. Use your brains. Don't be distracted. Once you make that mistake of being distracted over a man, your life will never be your own. You will get the burden a woman always does. So we have this sense here of like this really important, admonition on the part of the mother to not be distracted. What she's saying here is don't get pregnant. Like she's hoping that she'll go on and, go to university. And so obviously getting pregnant would be a real derailing of that plan. So we have this very feminist thing that is happening here, like this exhortation on the part of the mother that things are changing, but in fact it is up to us to change them. One of the things we were going to look at today is the feminist tone in the novel, but I realize it comes up so often in other pieces that I'm not sure we need to pull it apart separately. But here we have the matriarch, the mother of the story, talking very clearly about the fact that there are changes coming in the lives of girls and women. Okay, now we're going to dive into the text itself. On page 3, we have the beginning of the novel, which is also the beginning of the story, The Flats Road. We spent days along the Wawanish River helping Uncle Benny fish. We caught the frogs for him. We chased them, stalked them, crept up on them, along the muddy riverbank under the willow trees and in marshy hollows full of rat tails and sword grass that left the most delicate, at first invisible, cuts on our bare legs. Old frogs knew enough to stay out of our way, but we did not want them. It was the slim, young green ones, the juicy adolescents that we were after, cool and slimy. We squished them tenderly in our hands and then plopped them in the honey pail and put the lid on. There they stayed until Uncle Benny was ready to put them on the hook. He was not our uncle or anybody's. So this is such a masterful opening. It is, we're obviously talking about a very young girl at this point. And again, it's very nicely chronological. And what we see from the very beginning here is this real foregrounding of the geography, of the nature. And it is it's very clear that her childhood surroundings, the geography of southwestern Ontario really shaped Alice Munro and certainly shapes her fiction. I love this notion of these sword grasses that will, cause these cuts that at first were not visible and then developed. There's a lot here about development. There's a lot here about growth. We have these young frogs, adolescent frogs. She's not interested in the old ones. There's this notion of growth and this notion of fecundity and this notion of richness. But of course, we also have this young girl who is doing something that's very kind of tomboyish. And it's interesting to me, too, that we have the first person plural. So the first person is I did this, I did that. The first person plural is we did this, we did that. And we have this we from the very beginning, and we don't, in fact, know who these people are. In fact, it's not until, page 30 or so that we hear the name Dell spoken. So we don't know the name of this narrator for a long time, which makes sense because she is the one telling the story. So there's no reason why she would be saying her name. We also don't know that it is her younger brother, Owen, who she is with at this point. I'm very interested in the names. I don't know why Alice Munro chose Dell. It's Della is the full name. And Jordan is interesting to me. I mean, first of all, I think of the almonds, delicious Jordan almonds, but I don't think that's the reference that she was looking for. So Jordan, I think of the river, I think of crossing the River Jordan. So there is this idea of evolution and this idea of being tested and this idea of maturation and journeying and growth that is all, I think, very, inherent in the names. And Owen, I don't know if he's Owen something. I haven't really dived too deeply into that. Okay, but we have this we, which is very important at the beginning because it is denoting Dell and Owen, Jordan, who are, these young children, but it also is bringing in this idea with the reader. When the reader reads, we did this and we did that, there's a little part psychologically of the reader that feels included in that in a way that I think is very powerful. I also love this line, he was not our uncle or anybody's. So you have this sense here of family as being something that's kind of negotiable, and family as not always being what it seems. And these kind of unorthodox situations in families where Uncle Benny is essentially part of their family, but he's not related to them. You also have a somewhat unorthodox situation where the father is spending his time on the Flats Road and the mother is in fact in town. So right from the beginning, we have this idea that things are kind of not exactly what they seem, but we have this idea of the landscape as being very, very important at the beginning. So in terms of the structure of the novel, I mentioned before that it is essentially interlocking short stories. And you can tell that in part because you have these arcs that are completed. The first one has everything to do with Uncle Benny. The one, Age of Faith, has everything to do with her finding a church. Baptism or baptizing has to do with her relationship with someone who is a Baptist. So you have these kind of complete arcs that are contained essentially in each one of these stories. But there were also some ways that are very specific and very telling for me, where she's reintroducing characters in a way that makes you feel like you like already know who Fern Doherty is from the first one. And then we have this line: after we rented the house in town, we had a boarder, Fern Doherty, who sang in the United Choir. So this is we have this reintroduction of her in a way that really makes it feel like you have never met her before. We also have this on page 115. I picked on my brother Owen to tell. It's so funny. It must be a Canadian thing to say I picked on someone instead of I picked someone. But in this case, she says, I picked on my brother Owen. We already know, by page 115, we are very aware that her brother's name is Owen. So this is not necessary, this kind of reintroduction of him. And in fact, it makes you feel very distanced. And it is very much as if you have just come across this, in a different publication, in a literary magazine or, some other context. So there's some very clear ways in which it feels like these are short stories, not pieces of a novel that are really flowing one to the next. Another way you can tell that they're short stories, not only is that each one stands on its own, but you could almost move them out of order chronologically and they still would make sense and all of the arcs would still feel complete. So I spoke before about the fact that she writes very long short stories, but I think it's worth taking a very quick look at the Flats Road to get a sense of how rich these stories are. So in the beginning, we have this idea of her childhood. We are introduced to Uncle Benny, and then we are introduced to her mother and father. And you have this sort of diametric, it's almost the same space on the page. It's right in the middle of two opposite pages where she says, my mother didn't want to live on the Flats Road. And then she says, my father was different. So you have this sense of them being introduced as very different people. Then we have this whole question of whether or not this young Dell can write, because Uncle Benny cannot. And so young Dell, and it's kind of uncanny and amazing because she talks about Uncle Benny says, like, can you write? And there's this sense of the reader as being like, boy, can she? I mean, this young Dell Jordan is going to turn out to be one hell of a writer. Dell Jordan is not actually Alice Munro, but we are certainly, invited to think about it that way. And then we have the whole kind of, story arc where Benny goes and gets Madeline, who has the baby Diane, and takes her on as his wife. And it's harrowing and terrible because, in fact, Madeline is abusing Diane. So we have this whole notion of motherhood as not working very well in that situation. Then we have another iteration of motherhood as not working very well because we have a description of the fox farming. So Alice Munro's father was a fox farmer, and eventually it did not go well. And he then became, I think, a turkey farmer, but he was never, then he did mink. Then he did mink, and then I think people stopped wearing fur coats, which was very good. And then he moved on and became a turkey farmer, but in fact never made much money. So, but the important thing about the foxes is that if they are startled, they will eat their young. And there's kind of this study about why that might happen. Is it because they're just so anxious? Is it because they don't want the young to suffer some sort of fate that they can sense? Is it sort of a mercy killing? So we have this very sort of harrowing look at maternity right at the beginning of the story. So we have this idea, it is a short story with some very identifiable arcs, but it's very complicated in many ways, and we have a lot of digressions, but it all fits so beautifully together. And in fact, you can look at almost every single one of these stories, chapters, and you can see that kind of beautiful architecture that really allows for a lot of digression. It's not even really digression; it just allows for this kind of accumulation of plot and of suspense and of resolution that is really, really rewarding. There are also some things, though, very importantly, that provide cohesion throughout the novel. The first is simply that all throughout we have this first person narrator. I did this, I thought that. Occasionally it's we, but for the most part it is I. And that cohesion is really important. We have the cohesion of geography. The whole entire thing happens in the town where Del Jordan is living. So we have this geography, this sort of sense. We have kind of a map of how the town works and where the river is and how her father's on kind of the wrong end, the wrong side of the tracks, way down at the end of the Flats Road, and her mother is more on Main Street. We also have a similar cast of characters and family. So the family, and even people like Fern Doherty, Uncle Benny, these are people who are consistent not through the entire novel, but they come up enough that you feel like you have a sense, and the family is very consistent. So you have a cast of characters that makes it feel cohesive, which is very important, or else it would feel, I think, too jumbled and too mixed up. Also, we have the gift of chronology. Any writers out there, just remember chronology is your friend. And in fact, Alice Munro is using it to great effect here. Speaking of things that Alice Munro is using to great effect, we are going to talk about this radical honesty, this kind of candor that allows her to articulate these really beautiful moments that seem in some ways momentous to me. The first example we are going to look at is on page 53 and 54. This is after her Uncle Craig has died, and poor Del is really grappling with the idea of death. My mother's usual positiveness seemed clouded over. My cold appetite for details irritated her. I followed her around the house, scowling, persistent, repeating my questions. I wanted to know. There is no protection unless it is in knowing. I wanted death pinned down and isolated behind a wall of particular facts and circumstances, not floating around loose. A little further down, her briskness and zeal seemed false and vulgar. I did not trust her. Always when people tell you you will have to face this sometime, when they hurry you matter-of-factly toward whatever pain or obscenity or unwelcome revelation is laid out for you, there is this edge of betrayal, this cold, masked, imperfectly hidden jubilation in their voices, something greedy for your hurt. Yes, in parents too. In parents particularly. So a couple of things. Here we have, again, this kind of radical honesty, this real, this idea of following her around, persistent and scowling. It's lots of times it doesn't, put our young narrator in the best of lights, which is, again, part of this radical kind of honesty. But this idea, too, of it's such a universal thing, the way that she's articulating I wanted death pinned down and isolated behind a wall of particular facts and circumstances, not floating around loose. So one of the real gifts of this collection is obviously it is written by an adult, and 1971. So she's born in 31, she's 40 years old. So you have this idea of these are childhood preoccupations, and she talks about wanting to list everything in her town and wanting to be very accurate when she is telling these childhood stories. So there's a real, really wanting, in fact, to inhabit this child's world, but it is, she's doing that with the verbal acumen of an adult, and obviously some of the understanding and wisdom and knowledge of an adult. But I think she does this amazing job of asking these childhood questions in a way that makes them feel universal and very clear. This idea of wanting death, pinned down and behind a wall of facts, not loose. So I think that it's just really incredibly well done. I also love the use of the present tense here. We talked about that a little bit in the first session. So when she's using the present tense, when she is saying things like, there is this edge of betrayal, this cold, masked, imperfectly hidden jubilation in their voices. So you have this, most of this, in fact, is in the present tense. So you get the sense of this as being kind of a truth that still exists. It's not something that was specific to young Del Jordan's experience of childhood in Canada. It is, in fact, sort of this truth that she is presenting. Again, I think it's worth reading this part. Always. I mean, she's also really putting, a lot of emphasis here on the fact that this is always the fact. Always when people tell you you have to face this sometime, when they hurry you matter-of-factly towards whatever pain or obscenity or unwelcome revelation is laid out for you. And then she goes on. So this idea of these things as being in present tense makes them feel sort of eternal in a way that is very, very powerful. Also, it's important here that the language is very childlike in lots of ways. I mean, the idea of wanting death behind a wall of facts. I mean, it's sophisticated enough language that it feels very convincing, and it feels, in fact, very wise and philosophical. But it is very much, the articulation of a very precocious child in a way that I think really makes the work resonate. On page 87, we have another example of this kind of very clear moment. This is when her mother is describing, having been in school herself, and she was very self-taught. She, in fact, was, her mother was a religious fanatic, and she did not get the education she wanted and was meant to stay at home and take care of her father. And in fact, the mother left. And when she gets to school, she in fact is self-taught, and so a lot of what she is saying is, other people are making fun of her. So when they're laughing at her Latin, we then have this paragraph that the mother is recalling. And my mother could never help being thrilled and tender recalling this. She was full of wonder at her old young self. Oh, if there could be a moment out of time, a moment when we could choose to be judged naked as can be, beleaguered, triumphant, then that would have to be the moment for her. Later on comes compromise and error, perhaps. There, she is absurd and unassailable. Unbelievable. This is unbelievable prose. We have here these contradictions that we spoke about in the first exploration of her prose. These words that seem totally contradictory, but that are actually, they function very well together. Thrilled and tender, those are not that different, but they're certainly different. But this idea of beleaguered, triumphant, so those are things that are fairly heavily in opposition to each other, and yet you could experience both of them at the same time. And then a little further down, she is absurd and unassailable. I actually also really love the sort of resonance in terms of the vowels. It's almost assonant being rhyming of vowels, not consonants. Absurd and unassailable. It's beautiful because the words sound similar, and yet they are really very, very different. So this again is it's interesting that this is also from the mother. I don't know why I'm choosing. I mean, I guess there's probably a lot here. We're talking about lives of girls and women, so certainly the mother-daughter dyad is very important throughout. But it is interesting that I have chosen these. Let's see what the next one is. It's on page 101. This is actually also about the mother. It's a moment when the mother, I mean, it also makes sense too. There's a lot of, it's not just conflict, but there's a lot of tension between young Del and her mother for lots of good reasons. Del doesn't want to be like her mother. She's often embarrassed by her mother, but her mother is really this force that in fact, shapes her life in many ways. So this is actually also kind of a continuation of their discussion of death. This is when the mother lets Del know, in fact, that her actual uncle, not her granduncle, but that her mother's brother is in fact dying of cancer. And we have this really telling, very short paragraph. Just before Fern came in one door and Owen came in the other, there was something in the room like the down flash of a wing or knife, a sense of hurt so strong, but quick and isolated, vanishing. So I love the use of figurative language here too, but there is this sense of being so perceptive and again, being able to sort of crystallize and articulate. There was the down flash of a wing or knife, a sense of hurt so strong, but quick and isolated, vanishing. In some ways, she's very hurt by the fact that she doesn't have more of a relationship with this brother. And young Dell is really sensing that very acutely and is able to articulate it. In fact, using figurative language, using this metaphor about the knife or the wing flash, which is it's just absolutely stunning. The last one we're looking at is on page 154. Oh, I love this one. This is not, in fact, about the mother. It's a little more uplifting. Although not entirely uplifting, which I love, of course. I'm not usually that interested in uplifting. I mean, sometimes, yes, but not always. Here we have on page 154. It seemed to me that winter was the time for love, not spring. In winter, the habitable world was so much contracted. Out of that little shut-in space we lived in, fantastic hopes might bloom. But spring revealed the ordinary geography of the place. The long brown roads, the old cracked sidewalks underfoot, all the tree branches broken off in winter storms that had to be cleared out of the yards. Spring revealed distances exactly as they were. So this is during that amazing, it's during the short story, Changes in Ceremonies, where she's first becoming interested in boys and first interested in this idea of love. So this idea that winter, with all of its kind of illusion, and in Canada, you would have this thick blanket of snow, that under that you could imagine all sorts of things, but in fact, spring, reveals what in fact these distances and these sort of realities look like. So again, we're having a figurative language moment here that is really articulating this beautiful idea that essentially the hope that can be kindled in the winter time is in fact more potent than in fact spring. So religion is sort of a theme, for lack of a better word, that really pervades the whole entire novel. Not the whole entire novel, but a lot of it. In fact, the center story that comes right at sort of the midpoint of the novel, which is always, an important time to pay attention, is a story called The Age of Faith. And we know, in fact, that Dell's mother is agnostic/atheistic, and we know that Dell does not go to church. And this is happening in a town where, in fact, churches are extremely important and everyone has one. It's important to remember, which I did not know this, but a lot of the Midwest would have the Midwest of the United States, but also of Canada and of Ontario, in this case, southwestern Ontario, was settled by people who were fleeing England and Scotland and Ireland in order to practice their own religions. So the religions and the churches would have been very, very important, certainly in 1931, in the childhood of Alice Munro and of this young Dell, in a way that it makes total sense that you would have an entire chapter, an entire story devoted to this and more. I mean, religion really pervades even outside the scope of the Age of Faith. But I love the way that she begins The Age of Faith with, we're going to talk about the humor, but I found this very funny, with the idea that her mother had really scared her about burglars. So she has this on page 103. Later on, of course, I began to doubt the existence of burglars, or at least to doubt that they would operate in this manner. A little further down, I had never had a picture of God so clear and uncomplicated as my picture of the burglars. So again, this is information that she's getting from her mother, which has to do also, it's not reassuring information. Her mother is full of all sorts of, warnings and admonitions, in this case about burglars, apparently. But the point that she could see them much more clearly than God tells you a lot about, what is being conveyed to her by her mother. Then on page 105, we put this into context of the county. The people who settled Wawanach County and built up Jubilee were Scotch Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Methodists from the north of England. To be Anglican was therefore not fashionable, as it was in some places, and it was not so interesting as being Catholic or Baptist, not even proof of stubborn conviction like being Presbyterian. However, the church had a bell, the only bell in town, and that seemed to me a lovely thing for a church to have. So this is during her exploration of churches, but just the proliferation of all of these churches in this tiny town tells you, in fact, of the presence of them. And, later on, her first sexual experience is really, really colored by this desire to not be baptized. And it really is a crucial moment. I mean, her very first kind of love affair, well, her very first physical love affair, it comes to an end, in fact, because she can't align with one specific church. On 110, we have this. So here was what I had not known, but must always have suspected existed, what all those Methodists and Congregationalists and Presbyterians had fearfully abolished, the theatrical in religion. From the very first, I was strongly delighted. So I love this because we have this humor sneaking in here a little bit. She's loving the theatricality of this church that she goes to. And but you have this sense of this church, what she is choosing as being in opposition to all of these other churches. So we see her from the start as a little bit tomboyish and a little bit, sort of ready to be iconoclastic, very much like her mother, in fact, although she's really pushing against the idea of being like her mother throughout the entire novel. But this idea of being drawn, she really is drawn to faith because she really wants to know. Part of it, has to do with the idea of death, but it's really this romantic idea of kind of the ritual and the theatricality of all the passion that is inherent in religion. Then on page 123, so very tellingly and sort of impactfully, the end of Age of Faith ends with sort of a crisis of faith, essentially. This is the part in the book where the dog, Major, has started eating sheep. And it's interesting how much humor is incorporated into this. We're going to look at that when we look at the humor soon. But it's a very sort of dire and very difficult time because, in fact, young Owen is understanding that they are going to have to put down his dog because it is starting to eat sheep, and Owen decides that he wants to turn to religion and pray, and maybe that will help. So as her younger brother is facing the fact that God is not going to help him, young Dell is also facing that same fact. So we have this on 128. God would not alter it. If God was on the side of goodness and mercy and compassion, then why had he made things so difficult to get at? Praying for an act of execution not to take place was useless simply because God was not interested in such objections. They were not his. Down a little bit further, she's really feeling very emotional about her younger brother trying to pray because she, in fact, understands it's futile. Get up, Owen, I said roughly. It's not going to do any good. It won't work. It doesn't work. Owen, get up. Be a good boy, darling. Which, darling, killed me. I was like, she sounds like such a little mom here, or like a wife or something. He swiped at me with his clenched fists, not taking time to open his eyes. With the making of his prayer, his face went through several desperate private grimaces, each of which seemed to me a reproach and an exposure, hard to look at as skinned flesh. Seeing somebody have faith is no easier than seeing someone chop a finger off. Do missionaries ever have these times of astonishment and shame? So this is so powerful. I mean, there's a real violence here. This idea of seeing the faith and how difficult the faith is for this young child, this young Owen. It's like having someone chop a finger off. I mean, it's, again, this violence and the difficulty and the pain in it. And then the fact that she is ending the story / chapter with this rhetorical question is so powerful. Do missionaries ever have these times of astonishment and shame? So this is also a perfect segue into our next section, which is the idea of shame. Perhaps not surprisingly, shame is something that also pervades the novel, and in fact, it has quite a bit to do with religion. It also has to do with sex, which also makes sense, although way more to do with religion than sex. And I actually, throughout this book, found young Dell Jordan to be fairly liberated in terms of her own sexuality, which was great. Not so much being naked, although later in the book, she has a really a time when she feels dazzling and like absurd or something when she is lying naked, so that she and Jerry can she and Jerry are not like, seeing each other's bodies. She's just kind of offering her own body. so that he can see it, he is still fully clothed in a way that, in fact, is very empowering for her. But in fact, there is not a lot of reciprocity. Although eventually between her and Jerry, there is quite a bit. Okay, so we are going to move on to talk about shame. One tiny minor note before we dive into shame, which is that the word sham comes up again and again. And I don't think sham and shame really have anything to do with each other other than like they're very close, to each other. But this idea of there's a lot of shamming and whether people are shamming and things being a sham. So it's interesting that I kept hearing that because I think as young Del Jordan is trying to figure out what's happening in the world, there is this sense of needing to understand what is real and what is kind of performance. But in terms of shame, we are going to look first on page 49. So this comes at a point when Mary Agnes Oliphant, who is, I believe she's like in the next generation up, she's a cousin. So she's like kind of like a great cousin or like an aunt kind of age. She is the daughter of Aunt Moira, who I believe is the age of the grandparents, if that makes sense. So Mary Agnes Oliphant is quite a bit older than Del, and I think has some sort of neurodivergent thing going on. It's not really explained. But this is just after there is a little summary of the fact that Mary Agnes once went with a bunch of boys, I believe it's to the fairgrounds. Yes, to the fairgrounds, and took off all of her clothes and was left lying in the cold mud. So, it's left up to the imagination what happened there, but it did not sound good. I supposed that the degradation, for my mother told the story to warn me that some degradation was possible if you ever were persuaded to go off with boys, lay in having all her clothes taken off, in being naked. Having to be naked myself, the thought of being naked, stabbed me with shame in the pit of my stomach. Every time I thought of the doctor pulling down my pants and jabbing the needle in my buttocks for smallpox, I felt outraged, frantic, unbearably, almost exquisitely humiliated. I thought of Mary Agnes's body lying exposed on the fairgrounds, her prickly cold buttocks sticking out. That did seem to me the most shameful, helpless-looking part of anybody's body. And I thought that if it had happened to me to be seen like that, I could not live on afterwards. Interestingly, the very next word is Del. You and Mary Agnes ought to go for a walk. This is the first time we hear the name Del. So this idea of her deep humiliation at being naked, and you get the sense that part of what's happening here is she's imagining more, she understands that there's more than just being naked. But for her, just the idea of being naked is enough to cause really, really deep humiliation and shame. So you do not get the sense that her family was very, body positive, but simply being naked and the repetition of the word naked over and over instead of, unclothed or nude. It's a very sort of, harsh version of that concept. And it's really very shameful for her. On page 64 and 65, we have this almost immediately following the moment when Del, in fact, bites Mary Agnes's arm. As long as they lived, most of them would remember that I had bitten Mary Agnes Oliphant's arm at Uncle Craig's funeral. Remembering that, they would remember that I was highly strung, erratic, or badly brought up, or a borderline case. But they would not put me outside. No, I would be the highly strung, erratic, badly brought up member of the family, which is a different thing altogether. Being forgiven creates a peculiar shame. This shame was physical, but it went far beyond sexual shame, my former shame of nakedness. Now it was as if not the naked body, but all the organs inside it, stomach, heart, lungs, liver, were laid bare and helpless. The nearest thing to this that I had ever known before was the feeling I got when I was tickled beyond endurance. Horrible, voluptuous feeling of exposure, of impotence, self-betrayal. And shame went spreading out from me all through the house, covered everybody, even Mary Agnes, even Uncle Craig, in his present, disposable, vacated condition. To be made of flesh was humiliation. It's so powerful. I mean, again, this is a real moment of candor and a real moment of honesty. What this young girl is feeling. I mean, she just bit someone, but this is also a moment she's at a funeral and she is really wrought about death and this idea of shame as being kind of all pervasive. It's interesting how deeply she feels it and how it's in her organs essentially, and then how it is also spreading out from her. So you have this very visual and also very corporeal sense of how deep this shame goes. This is in a section called Errors of the Living Body, which is the one about Uncle Craig dying and the one about death. But it is, and it's actually, there's Princess Ida in between, and then we have Age of Faith. So we have this sense here of this shame as being really very well embedded even before she has her her religious exploration. Okay, and then the last one we're going to look at is on 128. We're not going to delve into this too deeply, but we're just returning very briefly to the last sentence of the story here, which is, do missionaries ever have these times of astonishment and shame? So we have the word shame as the last word in the entire story here, and this is the story is Age of Faith. So we have shame as this last word in the chapter that is concerned with her faith, exploration. It's important to note the last word, even of a sentence, but certainly of a paragraph or a chapter, or in this case, what is essentially a short story. There is a lot of weight on that final word, and so to end on shame here, it is a rhetorical question, but it feels very rhetorical here. This idea of missionaries and whether or not they feel astonishment and shame. Again, there we have that beautiful echo, just like absurd and I can't remember now, but this idea here of astonishment and shame, that sibilant sound, the astonishment and shame. It's so this kind of repetition, but ending heavily on shame is really underscoring the fact that this is kind of a bedrock sensation for her. It seems very fitting that we would move on from this idea of shame to the idea of sex. So as someone who is interested in sexual liberation and who is deeply anti-puritanical and is suspicious about a lot of religious attitudes towards sex, I am happy to say that in this book, which is really somewhat preoccupied with churches and organized religion, I actually found I was very happy to find that Del Jordan, is her experiences of sex are filled with curiosity and openness and wonder. I mean, she has the terrible thing with Mr. Chamberlain where he is masturbating in front of her, but we do have this idea of her as not being too scarred by that, and also as being, really invested in the idea of romance, but also of physical pleasure. So I want to look at some of these moments when sex comes to the fore because they're incredibly well done. The very first thing we're going to read actually is a time when someone here, in this case, I think it's Naomi. Yes, it's Naomi. Her very best friend, Del's best friend, is talking about essentially is equating shame and humiliation with and fault with sex. And even at this point, we have the idea of Del as being somewhat contrary, as understanding that sex doesn't only have to be negative and full of shame and the woman's fault. So here we have this. Naomi wanted to talk about the incident in the bicycle shed. The girl Dale McLaughlin had done it to, asthmatic Violet Toombs, who had moved away from town. I mean, this is one of those paragraphs that's like literally an entire, it's not even a paragraph, it's a sentence, it's a whole novel unto itself. I mean, the name and the specificity and the bicycle shed, I mean, it sounds terrible and we don't know what happened here, but asthmatic Violet Toombs, Toombs, I mean, who had moved away. You have this sense here of an entire narration that is just waiting to be explored, but it also is so satisfying even in this very finite form. So, and then we have Naomi say this, good thing she moved, she disgraced herself here. It wasn't all her fault. Yes, it was. It's the girl's fault. Here we have Naomi, in fact, promoting this narrative. Naomi's mother seems to have seems to know a lot about sex, and I think has a book maybe about sex. So Naomi seems to be somewhat of a font of wisdom, and yet even at this point, Dell is suspicious and understands that in this case, certainly the fault is not Violet Toombs's. So we have that. We have many more moments that have to do with sex than this, but this is an early one, and happily we see Dell kind of pushing back. On 162, we have this. This year, our first year in high school, Naomi and I held almost daily discussions on the subject of sex. A year ago, we had liked to imagine ourselves victims of passion. Now, we were established as onlookers, or at most, cold and gleeful experimenters. So, and then it says here, we had a book Naomi had found in her mother's old hope chest. So, they're doing some exploration of all sorts of different parts and of sex. But I love the idea of gleeful experimenters and this idea that they used to be victims of passion, this kind of amorphous passion, and now they're getting more of a sense of they're on the sidelines and they're observing and perhaps experimenting a little bit, but they're sort of moving in the direction of sexual awakening, but are not quite there yet. Then we have on page 222, this is when she's over at Jerry's house, Jerry being the other really brainy kid in her class, and they get kind of lumped together because they're both very bookish. And this is when she is over at Jerry's house. Jerry is a single child, he's an only child, and is being raised by a single mother. I thought of my mother, who would publicly campaign for birth control but would never even think she needed to talk to me. So firmly was she convinced that sex was something no woman, no intelligent woman, would ever submit to unless she had to. I really liked that better. It seemed more fitting in a mother than Jerry's mother's preposterous acceptance in decent practicality. I thought it quite offensive for a mother to mention intimacies a girl might be having with her own son. The thought of intimacies with Jerry Story was offensive in itself, which did not mean that they did not occasionally take place. So I love this idea that her mother is like, oh my gosh, no intelligent woman would ever have sex. Because of the way that it is framed here, we understand that Dell is in fact of a different mind. We also know because of some of the conversations with Naomi and because of some of what is happening with Jerry's Story, that she is in fact very interested in sex. Then we actually, this is right before the time when they go upstairs and she takes off her clothing so that it's sort of an experiment, so that Jerry can have a good look at a grown woman, which he's never done before. And we have this, it's a sentence unto itself. It says, I felt absurd and dazzling. So again, this idea of these early experiences of sex as both being kind of absurd and awkward and uncomfortable, but also dazzling and also exciting. So that mixture here is really, really powerful. And I love the way that she captures even the Mr. Chamberlain masturbating in front of her thing. There are parts of that seem just very interesting to her. She largely feels like it doesn't have anything to do with her. I think she afterward is feeling quite traumatized, although we're about to get to a part where we have a moment of catharsis. So on page 251, I love this paragraph so much. So this is when she finally has a boyfriend who she is more sort of romantically attached to than Jerry Story. And we have this kind of sexual experience that she has. It's just so beautifully articulated. It's down to earth and real and just very powerful. Now was the end of all our early sweet gropings, rainy games in the truck. From now on, we made love in earnest. We made love on the truck seat with the door open and under bushes and in the night grass. Much was changed. At first, I was numb, overwhelmed by the importance, the name and thought of what we were doing. Then I had an orgasm. I knew that was what it was called from Naomi's mother's book, and I knew what it was like, having discovered such seizures by myself some time ago with many impatient, indeed ravenous, imaginary lovers. But I was amazed to undergo it in company, so to speak. It did seem almost too private, even lonely a thing, to find at the heart of love. So quickly it came to be what had to be achieved. I could not imagine how we had once stopped short. We had come out on another level, more solid, less miraculous, where cause and effect must be acknowledged and love begins to flow in a deliberate pattern. So there's a lot I love here. I love how openly she's talking about orgasm. I love how openly she's talking about having masturbated. And I love this part here too. I could not imagine how we had once stopped short. So what I like about this is Dell is someone who is going to find pleasure. It's not just her boyfriend who is in fact going to have an orgasm. She herself also understands that this is the point of what they're doing, which is very empowering for a woman. You know, this would be what, mid 1940s. It's really laudable and I think really beautifully phrased. Then 256 and 57. This is the cathartic moment that I was mentioning before. This is when she and Naomi are kind of reconnecting. Naomi at this point is pregnant and is about to get married. And then Dell is able to tell her about her first sexual experience. I told her about the peonies, the blood on the ground, the cat killing a bird. We lay on our stomachs across the bed and told everything, scandalous details. I even told Naomi, all this time later, about Mr. Chamberlain and how that was the first one I had ever seen and what he did with it. I was rewarded with her pounding the bed with her fist, laughing and saying, Jesus, I never yet saw anybody do that. After some time, though, she grew gloomy again and raised herself on the bed to look down at her stomach. You're lucky yet. You better start using something. You better be careful. So we have this sense here of sex, in fact, as you know, having repercussions that they need to be very careful with. But I loved the fact that eventually she got to have that cathartic moment that very acutely she missed. You know, she understood just soon after the experience with Mr. Chamberlain that it would be better if she could, you know, turn it into some sort of hilarious, horrifying story. And in fact, she is able to do that later in a way that feels very cathartic. And then finally, we're going to look at page 263. So this is a quotation that is very close to the end of the book. And in fact, it's at the end of the chapter that is chiefly occupied with her boyfriend and her sexual awakening. It is also a chapter that is really occupied with whether or not she will become part of the Baptist church and whether she will undergo a baptism. So she, in fact, that is what ends their relationship. And we have this beautiful paragraph. I looked at these lovers lying on the graveyard grass without envy or curiosity. As I walked on into Jubilee, I repossessed the world. Trees, houses, fences, streets came back to me in their own sober and familiar shapes. Unconnected to the life of love, uncolored by love, the world resumes its own, its natural and callous importance. This is first a blow, then an odd consolation. And already I felt my old self, my old devious, ironic, isolated self, beginning to breathe again and stretch and settle, though all around it my body clung cracked and bewildered in the stupid pain of loss. It's so beautiful. We have this incredible articulation of feeling like she is returning to herself because she is not, in fact, trying to be someone for her boyfriend, but this idea also of really experiencing this deep pain of loss. And this is a little bit of conjecture on my part, but I have been thinking quite a bit about this. Alice Munro married James Munro, Alice Laidlaw, married James Munro when she was 20 years old after only 2 years of university. So you can imagine that in many ways, you know, this was sort of a very young, very, childlike marriage that was happening. That's not even really what I mean. But, you know, like they couldn't have known each other very well. They were only 20 years old. I don't know how old he was. And then she had a baby right away, and then she lost a baby and then had another baby. So you have this sense of her having been thrust into adulthood, and she, you know, fairly consistently is publishing. And I don't know what James Munro was up to. He worked in a department store at first and then, in fact, opened a bookstore. But I can imagine that maybe the success that Alice Munro was having, despite her dedication to her family and her marriage and her children, I imagine that maybe was difficult for Jim, even though the book is dedicated to him. I'm tempted, and again, this is pure conjecture, to read this paragraph as also describing how she might have felt when she went off to the University of Ontario to become a professor in 1972. So a year after this book came out, perhaps this idea of wanting to come back to herself and her mischievous self and the self that recognizes the world around her and is kind of unfettered by love and dedication and passion. And it's really, it's a really optimistic reading of sex here at the end. I mean, she has a good experience of sex with this guy and then is able to sort of return to herself with and a self that she understands more and values more, in fact, because she has answered some questions for herself about romance and boys and passion and penises. Okay, we are going to look at humor in the novel and then we are going to close. On page 112, I was interested that the humor, there was more humor, at least that I was noticing, although I did go back and look to make sure that I hadn't just missed it. Maybe I was reading the first part in a bad mood. Actually, no, I wasn't. But this idea of there is more humor, I think, toward the second half of the book. A lot of the exploration of her young childhood, there just isn't quite as much kind of clever humor. Not in a way that it felt missing, but I did notice kind of an uptick in all the little ha marks that I was making in the margins after a certain point in the book. Okay, so on page 112... So there are many different forms that humor takes. Some of them are simply actual things that are happening, sort of, not quite slapsticky, but a little bit. And then a lot of it is wordplay. This first one is when she has gone to the church and she is, very interested, in fact, in finding out these different churches and exploring religion through all of these people who have a lot of conviction about it. The minister says this to her. Nice to see the good-looking young ladies out this nippy morning. I shook his hand with difficulty. I had a stolen prayer book under my coat, held in place by my crooked arm. I think this was so funny because we don't know it ahead of time, so it's a surprise to us in the same way that it would have been a surprise for her to all of a sudden have this, minister speaking with her. But it also is funny to me that she's stealing something from the church. You get this sense of mischief, but also a sense of not being too, restricted by rules. She's really for a good reason. She wants to take this prayer book because she wants, in fact, to understand faith, and she wants this gift of faith. But I just thought it was so well done. On page 115, I really, really enjoyed the fact that young Dell is not made out for any kind of home economics when she is trying to sew. Partially I like this because I was like, oh my gosh, if Alice Munro, like Joan Didion, is also this consummate hostess and incredible seamstress and able to do everything, I would be so dispirited. But in fact, I don't know that Alice Munro is a terrible sewer, but in fact, Dell is. And we know that Dell, in fact, is in her, search for God. One of the ways that she thinks she can prove him, as real is by making a prayer about not having to sew. So in fact, that prayer comes to be. The teacher says, Dell, you cannot sew. Here's a broom, sweep up the scraps. So then we have this. I was weak with relief and joy in spite of public shame, which I was used to. So I wanted to read that because here again we have the shame. She's both ashamed and relieved and filled with joy. She also is very happy because she gets to read in the back of the room. But she says, I got my library book about Mary Queen of Scots and read Disgraced but Unburdened alone at the back of the room. So this idea of being disgraced, disgrace is also, it's really sort of a religious term in some ways. So we have this idea of her as being disgraced and as being publicly shamed, which are all kind of very religious ideas. But she starts also to think this happened too easily. In fact, that God answering her prayer about sewing does not, in fact, prove that he exists because it seems too petty and too easy. And down at the bottom of the paragraph, she ends this paragraph with this. I wanted him to move in more mysterious ways. Which is so excellent because, of course, the received notion is that God moves in mysterious ways. And she says here, I wanted him to move in more mysterious ways. It just absolutely killed me. And a lot of what is so funny about the humor in this novel is that it's very deadpan. It's very, she's not trying to be funny here. In fact, she is just saying things that are very deadpan and in fact, very funny. 118 and 19. Obviously, it made sense to me that there was a lot of shame involved in this chapter about faith, but there was so much humor. This is when the humor really started to pick up, which I also think is excellent. The idea of being able to put together shame and humor so deftly is so good. So this is when she is telling her mother she's going to church. I'm going to the Anglican church. They have church on Good Friday. My mother had to sit down on the steps. Which is so funny. I mean, again, it's very subtle. She's just reporting what's happening and doesn't mean this to be funny, and yet it really is. And then right across the page here, Dell says, "Can I go?" "I'm not stopping you," said my mother, though she had actually moved in front of the door. Which was, again, so funny. This is just simple kind of blocking. This is like a little bit like the Bible under the arm. It's very efficient. It's very straightforward. And I just found it very funny. This is another example. This is also an Age of Faith of combining real pathos, real difficulty with humor. And it's kind of gallows humor, but it's also just, straight up funny humor. This is on 124 when young Owen and young Dell are hearing that their dog Major has been killing sheep. And Owen says this. Old sheep killer, said Owen, punching him proudly. Major put up with this, but was no more playful than usual. He did not seem to have regained his youth in any but the one astounding way. Which is so funny. This idea, it's also, again, we talked before about syntax as being very complex. Some of these passages are very hard for me to read because, in fact, the order of the words is not, it's not wrong, but it's not totally standard. But we have this idea here of like maybe because he's now like a hunter and he's off doing this crazy new thing that he would be puppy-like in other ways. And in fact, he did not seem to have regained his youth in any but the one astounding way. Also, the use of astounding there is so good. And it really speaks to, this heightened sense of everything that's happening in childhood. And then we have this. He licked the top of Owen's head in a patronizing manner and settled down to sleep again when Owen let go. He has to be tied up so he won't go after sheep again, old sheep killer. Potter said they'd shoot him if they ever caught him again. This was true. Major was indeed in the limelight. Which is also so funny. I mean, and as the reader, you're like, ooh, uh-oh, this idea of this dog as potentially having to be put down. These kids are not understanding the seriousness of it. And in fact, to them, it's like Major is in the limelight. Like this just seems exciting until it's going soon to feel really terrifying. On page 189, there are some one-liners in here that are just so funny. Fern was not one to grieve, in spite of her acquaintance with opera. So good, so funny, so straightforward, so cut and dried, but it tells us so much about Fern. Fern being the boarder of her mother. Down at the bottom of 205. This is when she and Naomi go out dancing with some men and she gets drunk for the first time. To my alarm, he turned out to be a fancy, inventive dancer, continually throwing me away from him and snatching me back, flipping himself around, snapping his fingers, doing all this without a smile, indeed with a dead serious, hostile expression. So funny. The best is a fancy, inventive dancer. And then this idea of, continually throwing me away from him and snatching me back. There's a certain kind of slapstick nature here, flipping himself around, snapping his fingers. All of these gerunds here with the ing, you get this kind of sense of movement. And all of these different short verbs, flipping, snatching, throwing, snapping. You have the sense of a lot of action and a lot of sort of variety of what is happening. And then the real kicker, despite, even after the idea of the funny, inventive dancer, is this idea of how he did it all indeed with a dead serious, hostile expression. It's so good. And honestly, there is so much humor in this book. We could talk for 6 hours just about the humor and how deftly Alice Munro wields it, but that is all we're going to look at today. So we are going to close today our exploration of lives of girls and women by looking at the very close of the novel. There is a lot of meta stuff throughout this novel. Meta simply meaning, when the novel is essentially talking about itself or talking about kind of the artifice of fiction or talking about writing in general. And we know, in fact, that the character Dell has begun a novel, and it is based on this family And at the very, very close, in the epilogue here, we have her encounter someone from the family. And it's really sort of astounding to her to see, her character essentially in real life and realize that there's quite a bit of dissonance. It also gets to this idea of her really wanting to capture this place. And the reminder of it here at the very end of the novel really helps us understand that she really, really has done that. We have a very good sense of this town. Jubilee, that's the name of the town. Oh my gosh. On 276, it did not occur to me then that one day I would be so greedy for Jubilee. I would try to make lists. The hope of accuracy we bring to such tasks is crazy, heartbreaking. Again, there's that present tense. There's that kind of proclamation. I also love crazy, heartbreaking. And there's no and. It's just a comma. It's very forceful that way. And no list could hold what I wanted, for what I wanted was every last thing, every layer of speech and thought, stroke of light on bark or walls, every smell, pothole, pain, crack, delusion, held still and held together, radiant, everlasting. Then this gentleman who is giving her lemonade says, "Believe me," he said, "I wish you luck in your life." People's wishes and their offerings were what I took then naturally, a bit distracted, as if they were never anything more than my due. "Yes," I said, instead of "thank you." It's so beautiful. I love the affirmation here. I love the strength. I love the way that we really are hearing essentially about, her burgeoning career. Like, this is a woman who has achieved what she is saying she wants to achieve here. She has done that. She has given us the sights and the smells and the potholes and the delusion and the, everything that makes up this town of Jubilee. So I hope that this exploration today has also given you a sense of just the absolute mastery of Alice Munro. Stay tuned for part 3, where we will dive very deeply into the story Silence. And if you didn't check out the first one, go and take a listen for kind of a deeper understanding of why the prose, in fact, is so, so rich. So, happy reading.